Okay, my name is Cornell Ellis, and I am so pleased, grateful to be amongst friends and family, such an intimate group, to have such an important conversation today. I'm the executive director and founder of a nonprofit educational support organization called BLOC, Brothers Liberating Our Communities. We work to increase Black male representation in schools. And today you're here for the Mayor's Commission on Reparations, Education Listening Commission. And so before we do anything further, again, I just want to thank you all for being here, for taking time out of you all's day to come and have an important conversation about the future of our students in Kansas City. I've been in education for over a decade, about 15 years now. And as a student in the Kansas City Public Schools, as a son of a teacher of the Kansas City Public Schools, as an educator in the Kansas City Public Schools, it has been my lifelong duty to serve our families and our communities. And this is just the next iteration of that privilege as I serve on the Education Commission as the Education Subcommittee Chair. And so it's my privilege today to lead us through an agenda that all of you should have on paper in front of you. And this is the welcome and greetings with myself. Before we move any further, though, I'd like to thank Paseo High School, thank the Mayor's Reparations Commissions, Mr. Goodman, and Ms. Commissioner Terry Barnes, Chairwoman Terry Barnes, for being leaders in this space, and especially Dr. Jennifer Collier as the Superintendent of Kansas City Public Schools. So I'd like to welcome her up at this time for her opening remarks, and we will move further from there. Go ahead and give her a round of applause. Dr. Collier.
I'm grateful that you asked about having this here in our space here in Kansas City Public Schools. As stated, I'm Dr. Jennifer Collier. I'm the proud superintendent here at Kansas City Public Schools. I stand before you this afternoon, first of all, to say welcome to Paseo Academy of our Fine and Performing Arts, and also to commend you for your work in studying the need for reparations for Black Americans and for your forthcoming recommendations to the City of Kansas City. We know that there is a precedent for reparations in the United States. Post-World War II, there were reparations for Japanese Americans placed in internment camps. There were reparations after the Civil War for former slave owners who were compensated for their land and lost workforce. There were also reparations that continue today in one form or another for some Native Americans. So reparations is not a new issue. But the time is now for a serious discussion about the case for reparations for Black Americans. There are some people in the country who want to rewrite history to say that slavery benefited Black people. But the time is now for this committee and for all of us, for everyone here in our city and really across the nation, to push back against these attempts to rewrite history by going on record to say that not only did slavery not benefit Black people, but in fact a debt is owed to Black people and to our children. In the Kansas City Public Schools, we understand this debt. In education, we talk about the deep, lingering inequality in education. These inequities are rooted in the fact that education for Black Americans was initially forbidden. Then after emancipation, we saw the rise of freedmen's schools, whose purpose was the maintenance of a servant class. And even in our district, Kansas City Public Schools, prior to the integration of schools, the Black schools primarily were using outdated and cast-off books of white schools. The discussion around reparations is not solely an education issue, though. It is an economic issue. It is a social-political issue, and it is a moral issue. And so I applaud you for your efforts, for the time that you're taking to explore and to address this very complex issue. And again, I wanted to say welcome to our space here at Paseo Academy, and I wish for a very productive meeting as we work to advance the Black community. Thank you all for your leadership.
Set of words to give us a context and understanding for why we are here. I took away this idea that a debt is owed to Black communities, to Black people, and to especially our Black children. And That's the reason why this commission was formed, and that's the reason why we're here today to have a conversation. So to continue with that thread of thought, I would like to move forward in the agenda and welcome Chairwoman Terry Barnes to give us a little bit of context of how we got to this place as a Reparations Commission. Go ahead and give her a round of applause.
Good morning, or good afternoon. I'm going to start with an apology. I am not dressed how I would normally be dressed to present to you all today, but this morning I spent 3 hours at Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church handing out food baskets and hygiene items to people in our community that have needs. And when I think about our discussion today on education, I think about the connection between the 163 people that we serve today and education and the need that we have in that area. So about 2 years ago, there was a group in Kansas City, a small grassroots group called the KC Coalition for Reparations. They met and began looking at reparations in a serious way and being connected to other organizations across the United States. They identified 5 injury areas that they thought would be really beneficial for Kansas City. Those injury areas are education, which we will talk about today, also criminal justice, housing, economics, and health. There are many more areas, but we've identified those 5 areas for Kansas City to plunge into. Back in 1989, John Conyers submitted a resolution for the federal government to enact reparations, and he introduced that bill every year. So we are really at a historic time in our United States when well over 26 cities are advancing the issue of reparations on their own. Kansas City was lucky enough, blessed enough to have a mayor and a city council who said yes, that it was time for Kansas City to take a serious look at reparations, and Mayor Cleaver. Mayor Q seated a 13-member commission back in May to take a look at these 5 harm areas and answer the question, what role did the city have in perpetuating these harms against the Black community? What policies, procedures, or practices do we have in place at the city that may perpetuate these items? And that's the work that we have in front of us. So we are grateful to be here. We thank you for being here, and we look forward to the next 12 months to explore these issues and to put forward recommendations to the City Council on what we can do as a city to remedy the harms that have been caused and to make sure that these harms don't continue. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring you Commissioner Ellis back to the stage.
So as you heard Chairwoman Barnes state and Superintendent Collier, this is not a new issue to the nation, to the world, not to Kansas City either. And nor is this close to being over. This is just the beginning of this process of researching the harms that were committed to the Black community through city and governmental policies to be able to reconcile those harms. A list of recommendations has been our task to come up to suggest to the city about what some of those repairs could look like. And so, as you heard me say before, an educator myself who's not only experienced and lived the education system in Kansas City, but also taught in it, I felt like it was my responsibility to be a part of this conversation. And so I requested to be a member of the commission through Mickey Dean, who was a member of the KC Reparations Coalition. And I was granted, again, afforded the opportunity to be a part of this monumental work. Uh-oh, you took my agenda. But I'm pretty sure we're about to move into our main item of today's presentation, which is a contextual and historical conversation about the history of education in Kansas City. As you heard Commissioner Barnes state, there's 5 harm areas that are being researched: health, criminal justice, economics, housing, and education. We hope that each one of those harm areas will have specific listening sessions that will allow the community to come out and talk just about one area. We've had one previous listening session to this that was a general listening session about reparations in general, held at Metropolitan Baptist Church, which I hope we will repeat as well. But if however you heard about this event today, please continue to follow us on social media, on the mayor's website, to continue attending and understanding the issue for reparations in Kansas City. But Spark Bookhart is going to be coming up, and he'll be giving us a lay of the land, if you will, about how we got here in Kansas City to the education system that we currently have. Spark, you can come on up, and I'll give a quick anecdote while you're getting started. As an educator myself, and as you heard me say, a product of the Kansas City education system, I was not a school kid. And actually, it's those types of kids that often become the best teachers. I was kicked out of several schools in the Kansas City Public School District, and I actually squeaked by and graduated from a private high school, Jesuit Catholic at Rockhurst High School. And so I've seen both sides of the train tracks. My mother taught at Central High School, Central Middle School for 30 years, finished her career at East High School, and she grew up on 41st and Prospect. We grew up on 75th and Troost. We had family members on the other side of Troost, and sometimes those family members weren't allowed to come to our house. Sometimes those family members weren't welcome at holidays because we understood that on the other side of the railroad tracks, on the other side of Troost, those were different circumstances. And as Commissioner Barnes told us this morning, everybody in our communities are seeking different needs and needing different things. And so as a person who experienced both sides of the railroad tracks of education, one on the east side of Troost in Kansas City Public Schools and finishing in Overland Park at Rockhurst High School, I was able to experience the different opportunities that students saw on a daily basis. All of you all as educators or folks that have experienced education can also speak to that, but Spark has the data and the story to really back up how we got to this place. And so as you look at the rest of the agenda, Spark will come and give us a brief history of the Kansas City Public Schools, kind of how we got to this space. We'll open up the space after Spark is done at around 2 o'clock for questions and clarifications from Spark's presentation. So feel free as you're listening to write things down, hold your questions until the end so that he can get through as much information as possible, because it's way more than 45 minutes worth of information. And then at 2:10, we'll open up the session for an open mic, which is truly what the purpose of this session is to hear from you all, to understand your questions, understand your clarifications, understand your concerns about reparations, and about your experiences in education. So I have teed up a couple folks in the audience to speak to us about their experiences in education after Spark during the open mic session. But I welcome everyone in the audience to bring down to the mic an experience, a thought, a question, or a concern about reparations in Kansas City education. So with that, now that you kind of have a lay of the land and what's going to be happening until 3 o'clock, I want to hand it over to our expert for the day, Mrs. Spark Bookhart. Give him a round of applause.
Good morning. What is it? No, it's afternoon. Afternoon. Commissioner Barnes, unlike Commissioner Barnes, this is probably definitely for me to start. I'm be comfortable in my jeans and shirt. But and I want to thank the people that's joining online too. I'm not going to stand behind the podium, so I'm just going to turn this a little bit to catch me. Cornell and Superintendent Collier was right. Education is such a critical component of our thinking about our survival and our existence here on the planet. specifically in Kansas City. I'm thinking of Scholar Amos Wilson, Dr. Amos Wilson, who simply stated that the purpose of education is for the survival of the people. Simply, it's for the survival of the people. And if you're not engaged in an education that's survival for that's a survival of the people, you're engaged in an education process where you do a magnificent job in solving other people's problems. And what we want to be engaged in is the process of solving our own problems, our own challenges. Why education and reparations? We have these 5 harm areas. Why is education so important to be one of those 5 harm areas? I think if you look at it in a hierarchical sense, education is probably the foundation of everything else. Like without the education component, you couldn't have any of those other harm areas, in my opinion. I'm not speaking for the commission, I'm just speaking this opinion of how important education is. And it's why I've been engaged in this process as primarily a parent in Kansas City, raising children, trying to navigate a functional, foundational education for our children. So I want to say that, I want to pronounce and say that from the beginning, that this is the position that I come from. I don't come from a position of a historian or a scholar or academician. I come from the position of a parent that is incredibly inquisitive about Black children and the education of Black children primarily, and that has led me on this decade journey, which is absolutely fascinating, which is why I'm still on it. Now, you can't talk about education in Kansas City, but you can't talk about education anywhere without being courageous about 3 things: race, place, and money. You might want to write it down, it might come up again. Race, place, and money. You can't talk about education without talking about race, place, and money, and how those interplay in our educational decisions. In fact, the tragedy of education in Kansas City, in my opinion, because we failed to be courageous in talking about race, place, and money. And I'm going to ask us today to be courageous in our thinking about, number 1, education and how it interplays with these 2 things. Now, I'm cutting a lot of this presentation out, a lot of the grounding, but I think it's important to start. You really have consolation. I'm moving on to camera now. Oh, okay. I think it's important that we really talk about the era that I speak on most in education in Kansas City, and that's under the DSEG era. I think the DSEG era is, number 1, vitally important to understand if we're really talking about education in Kansas City, cannot be ignored, and number 3, we cannot offer solutions or cannot think about solutions to education without understanding of this history, because we know people that don't understand their history are what? Doomed to repeat it. So that's why it's important for me to talk about this area. And then the last thing I'll say is, well, I'll say that last, so it can really be the last thing I say. All right. So I'm not from Kansas City. I grew up in Los Angeles. I came to Kansas City fresh out of undergrad. I moved here in 1995. So I've been here a long time. So essentially Kansas City, but I just wanted to provide that context. And when I moved to Kansas City, on the TV screen and in the newspapers, at least multiple times a week, there were literal fights and consternation and negative press and bad coverage about our school system. Kansas City, Missouri School District, as it was called then. And that was phenomenally bizarre to me I had never been in a place where you had these type of like open challenges, stripes, and fights. And letting them know a little ancient history, I moved here to go to the police academy. And after I finished the police academy, I would ride our streets. That's how I fell in love with our city, just being able to see our city from a perspective that a lot of people don't. And I would ask this question from seeing these news stories. I didn't have any children at the time. I would see these news stories, and I would start to ask, because I'm just intellectually curious, I started to ask the question, what's wrong with education in Kansas City? And I asked everybody that I could. And the answer that I got was shocking. Because it didn't matter how many people I asked. If I asked 20, 25 would say the same thing. And this was the answer that I got. I'm sorry, I don't have to click for something to move. This was the answer that I got. Superintendent, can you guys see that? Is that too far back? Superintendent turnover. That was the answer. And what I did is I went home and I graphed a chart similar like this on paper. And what I did was I started from the beginning of the school. I have a feeling that this is in the way of people. Am I right? I better not move it though. I hope you guys can see it. But what I did was I grabbed the superintendents. Let me step back here. I grabbed the superintendents. This year is 1898. Now the school district started in 1867, but they all look like, those decades look like this one, so I left it the same. 1898 to 1908 to 1918, I just grabbed the district superintendent by decade. Ooh, you got something there for me. All right, appreciate it. So I grabbed those over. Thank you, I appreciate you. I grabbed those superintendents. Which button do I push? Oh, come middle. Can you guys see that? No. Can't see. I've been on the break stuff, so I've been getting that. But it's all right. It's no big deal. We'll be able to track it. So what I found out was I put the number of superintendents on the top of the decade. So you see the first decade, 1898 to 1908, it was one superintendent that served that entire decade. The next decade, 1908 to 1918, one superintendent served that whole decade. Then it was 1918 to 1928. It was two superintendents, and that asterisk up there means that the superintendent crossed over decades, even at the beginning of the decade or at the end of the decade, one of them. So, what you see is the number of superintendent turnover, as you would say, graphed out by decade. And since everyone can't see, I'll say that we had a spike in superintendent turnover in the years between 1948 and 1958. And the question that I had is, what happened in the decade between 1948 and 1958 as it relates to education? And of course, we say the Brown v. Board decision. And the Brown v. Board decision primarily was the single focus for the superintendent turnover during that decade. One superintendent, before the ruling from the Supreme Court comes down, they just took off. Like, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm not going to deal with it, right? Then the Supreme Court ruling comes down, and the next superintendent basically tells the school board, hey, you know, I mean, it's the Supreme Court. What you gonna do? We gotta figure this out. And guess what happened to him? And I do mean him. Guess what happened to him when he mentioned that to the board as a solution? Yeah, they gave him the old heave-ho via the foot. All right. So then you have the first round of superintendent turnover because of this question of race. what are we going to do with those black kids? All right? However, there is always someone that comes up with a solution. And this gentleman right here, his name is James Hazlett. He was the superintendent that figured out what I call the Kansas City cheat code. And the Kansas City cheat code is, he said, hey, let's not worry about the Supreme Court. Like, we're not worried about the Supreme Court decision. We already have a hyper-segregated city. Let's just introduce attendance zones, and in those attendance zones, we will determine where children go to school by where they live. And because we are a hyper-segregated city, those attendance zones virtually guaranteed segregated schools. That's what I call the Kansas City cheat code. And the Kansas City cheat code, because he was rewarded because he was the superintendent from 1955 all the way until 1969. In fact, look at the chart up there. Between 58 and 68, there was still only one superintendent. It was that guy. So he was rewarded with a long superintendent career because he figured out what we're going to do about those black kids. Now, when is the next spike in superintendent turnover? I know it's far, so I'll tell you, it's between the years of 1968 and 1978. And we always ask the question, what happened in history in the decade of 1968 to 1978? Go ahead and tell me. White flight. Okay. He shot the layup. I mean, he shot and hit the rim. Hit the rim, then he go finance. Keep going. Keep telling me.
Assassinations.
Assassinations of who in particular? Dr. King. April 4th. April 4th, 1968. Dr. King is assassinated. As a result of King's assassination, so you gotta understand, King, you all know this, but King is committed principally to come to. King is principally committed to nonviolence. Everyone that knows King, everyone that was alive at that time, really understood this. But at the end of King's life, there was a youth movement happening that was pretty much eschewing nonviolence as a principle, right? But they had enormous respect for Dr. King. Well, when Dr. King was assassinated in such a violent way, they basically said, hey, nonviolence is over. And in 204 cities across this nation went up into what? Flames. Some people call them riots, some people call it uprising, some people call it rebellion. You call it what you need to call it. I'm just saying it happened. And Kansas City was not immune from one of those events. Now, you said white flight. In 1954, a touch of white flight started to happen. But because James Hazlett had the Kansas City cheat code, he was able to quell that white flight. Nothing was able to quell the white flight that happened as a result of parts of Kansas City going up in flames because of the assassination of Dr. King. All right? Now, it's important. This slide is, I hate it so far back, but what it says is, it's really important to understand. Because of 1954, and because we're trying, because of 1954, and because everyone's trying to figure out what do we do with those black children, people were coming up with solutions, right? White solutions to black perceived problems, right? And what happened was, on the local level, they found a solution. Created the attendance zones. But you know, like then, like today, Jeff City have to have their answer to what to do about the black children in Kansas City. And in 1957, they implemented a law in Jeff City that prohibited the automatic expansion of the school district. So in most cities you go to, the school district is the size of the city. It just matches the city. LA school district, Chicago school district, Nashville school district, Memphis school district, New York school district. We keep talking about it. But because of this law in the state of Missouri that only applied to Kansas City and St. Louis, it said, I'm trying to regulate my language. I don't give a care how much the city grows. The school district with the black kids in there is going to stay the exact same size as it is today. And that's why we have 14 different school districts within our city boundaries. So it's important to understand the backstory to all this so that you don't make the mistake of advancing solutions that don't really take into account the backstory. That's why we have all these school districts, right? So, those are the two things that happened as a result of 54. But as a result of the assassination of Dr. King, that's what I call the systematic and purposeful defunding of black education in Kansas City. And that's what I want to spend the last time talking, my last little piece of time talking about. Because in '68, after the assassination of Dr. King and after the uprising in Kansas City and hundreds of cities all over the nation, it scared, this is a legal term, it scared the bejesus out of white people. And white people left the city core, the inner city proper, the urban core, if you want to call it that, in droves. And they went to these all-white, homogeneous enclaves, like Hickman Mills. I know that sounds funny now, but like Center School District. They went to that white bastion of Grandview, right? They went to that white bastion. They moved into Ruskin in numbers like, you know what I mean? These were like white suburbs. Now it sounds funny now because, of course, these are not white suburbs, right? But I'm telling you, at the time, that's what happened. And the character and the nature of public education in Kansas City turned on a dime. And when I say turn on a dime, that is when the predominant white attitudes in Kansas City was education is no longer our issue. Our children aren't there, right? We got our own schools. We're not worried about education. And because they weren't worried about education, they did not fund education in Kansas City. And not only did they not fund education in Kansas City, they said any attempt to further fund education in Kansas City, we're going to deny. So I set that context just to talk about, to frame this in the understanding of reparations and understanding that what we're doing now is a direct result to what has been done. The challenges we have now is a direct result of this history. It's so phenomenal that we're here at Paseo High School. Because I've done this presentation over 1,000 times. And I don't think I've ever done it in Paseo High School. But I use this example from Paseo High School no matter where I do this presentation in the country. And I talk about Paseo High School because I say, this is a random page out of Paseo High School senior class, the yearbook of the senior class of 1965. A couple years before the assassination of Dr. King. I'll take a look, can y'all see it? And this is a random page from the senior class of 1970, a couple of years after the assassination of Dr. King. There was a complete, total overturning of the student population of the city. And the city turned its back on education, on public education in Kansas City, primarily because it was predominated by black children. Now, when we talk about reparations on a local level, we got to talk about local decisions that led to these type of harms, right? Because this era ushered in what I call the systematic and intentional defunding of the educational era, of education in Kansas City. So a couple things you had. Because you had a district that was this size and now is this size, right? You had a problem maintaining the physical plan, all the buildings and everything that you had going on in the school, right? That's not a problem that started and ended then. That's a problem that started then, and Dr. Collier can attest that it exists into this very day. And some of the solutions that we have entered into have exacerbated it because we didn't really understand the reason why it happened in the first place. So you had buildings that you couldn't heat in the wintertime. You had buildings that you couldn't cool in the summertime. You had rodents and rat infestations. You had books and learning materials that was, I mean, when you go back and read the newspaper and the accounts of the challenges that this district was having then, it's really a horror story. Specifically because of the physical plant, not because of what was going on in those buildings. Because you had primarily black teachers teaching black children in those buildings in some of the toughest conditions that you could imagine. But we've always had the challenge of teaching in tough conditions. The question is, what will we do about it? And what happens is, when you start to have white solutions for black problems, that's where it all goes awry. And that's what I want to spend the last couple minutes talking about. Oh, I'm already on that. It's important just to say this. Arthur Benson is an attorney. He's still around. He's an attorney in Kansas City. He's a civil rights attorney, and he said, you know what? I got the answer for those black children. What we're gonna do is we're gonna sue. Because those black children are in a school environment that's in violation of Brown versus Board of Education. Because they're in a segregated school system. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sue the schools. This is him talking. He said, yo, that's him. I'm just joking. I know you're laughing at my jokes. I know I've been up too long, so you're not laughing at my joke. He says, I'm gonna sue the school system. I'm going to sue those suburban school systems. I'm going to sue some districts over in Kansas. I'm going to sue the state. I'm going to sue the feds. And I'm suing all of y'all on behalf of these black children. And he took this into federal court as a civil rights case. And when he got to court, the judge said, please. And the judge started rearranging everything. He said, first of all, the feds didn't have nothing to do with it, so we're taking them out of the case. You know what? Those districts over in Kansas didn't have nothing to do with it, so we're taking them out of the case. Those suburban schools, they didn't have nothing to do with it, so we're taking them out of the case. And we're going to bunch these students up and the school district together, and we've gone suing the state. because the state is what allowed this to happen by not doing the funding, etc. This was the longest civil rights case involving desegregation at that time in the country. This case was filed, let me just tell you, this case was filed in 1977, and it wasn't settled until 2004. So from 1977 to 2004, we had a situation where the school is not being governed and run by who we think is being governed and run by. Cornell, would you allow me to tell us one little quick story to end up?
Please do. You should have 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, the judge, after he rearranged the case, he says, good, you win. Go fix it. And he had to fix this, he had to fix the system in two ways. He had to reverse, basically get a ratio of white students to black students in the school district, because it had become a majority black school district. So he had to erase that parity. I mean, he had to bring back that parity, and he also had to do it in the teacher pool. That's what the judge was looking at as, okay, this is going to be fixed. So after a year or so after the case, he went in to the judge, kind of like brag dancing, we getting to know our way, because he was able to bring parity back to the teaching pool. How did he do that? And why was it so easy? Any guesses? Oh, that's not a rhetorical question. I'm really asking about that. How was he able to take the majority of black teachers and turn it to the majority of white teachers in such a short period of time? This is way before Teaching America was a good try. I like his offensive aggression. He will shoot at the rim. That's no problem. That's right. I love that. I appreciate that. No, it was pre-Teach for America, but similar. It's really similar. That's why he's hitting the rim every time. Huh? Salary? Close? Come on, y'all. We had a majority of black teachers. Now, a couple years later, we have a majority of black teachers. How is that able to be done in such a short period of time? Huh? Yeah, exactly. If you want this type of teacher, guess what? You fire those teachers and hire the teachers you want. It's easy to do. Right? Games and incentives. Early retirement, some you don't have to fire, blah, 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 and then you get incentives to these teachers that you want to come into the district. So he goes back into the court and he's like really chest out, you know, excited about what he did. And the judge is like, yeah, but what about the students? And he had to drop his head and say, you know what, basically I can't do it. The district is broke. We got buildings that we can't heat in the wintertime. We got buildings that we can't cool in the summertime. It's rat infested. Blah, blah, blah. He all running down all the problems. And the judge said, hold my bid. And the judge proceeded to tax the entire state. He raised the taxes here, locally, but then he also taxed the entire state. Because when you need more funding for schools, you usually have a bond issue. But every time we went up for a bond issue, they was like, nah, get that out of here. Get that out of here. To the fact that this hadn't been a bond passed in Kansas City from then till now. Right? But because of that, the judge took it on he made it his prerogative. He's like, money's not going to be an issue. He said, it's not going to be money that's going to stop you, because I'm taxing the whole state. And when he put that tax in there, what you have is tax money coming from all over the state of Missouri. And it was funneled into Kansas City and into St. Louis, who had their own said case going at the same time. But what Kansas City was able to do, Kansas City received $2 billion with a B.
Say it again. They spent $2 billion. They sent $2 billion to our school district. Now, there's a couple questions I always ask. If the judge sends that kind of money in the school district, do you think that the judge wants the board, the school board, the elected school board, controlling that money? Answer is absolutely no. Right? So when we, as the news, TV consuming public, like I was when I moved here, we think and we point our eye to those people that we see on TV as the problem. But the problem is, they didn't have the power. The judge put in his own board that he selected, called the Desegregating Monitoring Committee, the DMC. And the DMC's role was really to oversee the district, because the judge has control of the district during this case. The judge can't be involved in like what we spent this on, what we spent that on. So the judge put his own panel in place, the DMC. And the DMC made all significant decisions for this school district. So if a teacher, a 6th grade teacher, somewhere down in the organization went to a conference and learned how 6th graders was, this is a real example by the way, learned how 6th graders were learning algebra because of a particular program, right? And she wanted to implement that program in her classroom next year. It would take her 18, 20 months to get the program approved. And how beneficial is a 6th grade program to teach algebra to 6th graders good when 6th graders that were supposed to be taught that is already in 8th grade, graduating from 8th grade course in 9th grade. Now, that's just one example. But think about the entire district being run in a similar fashion for all of that time. There's no way that you can have a functional school district in light of all of that forced dysfunction. And even to this day, you ask, and people live this history. When I do the extended version of what I'm talking about today, people go, oh yeah, okay, that was what was happening. Oh, I got it. Oh, that's what was mom. They make all the connections. But even to this day, you ask someone, explain to me, the role of DMC in education in Kansas City. They couldn't tell you. They don't know what you're talking about. They like, Run DMC is from Kansas City. Right? So all I'm trying to impress upon us today is that local education is a way more complex issue than we address it as. And if we are seeking reparations, are seeking repair from harm, we sure shouldn't be coming in the game talking about test scores and all the stuff that we talk about. Now, we spend the last couple minutes. I can't go through none of this stuff. I kind of went through it in a brief form, but I wanted to just let you guys know that this wasn't some like a spark cooked up facts, right? And I'm going to go through a couple of quotes that I pulled from my research, all right? This is from the Teachers College Record. This is a publication for teachers, and this was in June 2008. And it says, between 1969 and 1987, and I'm not going, I can stop at 1987 because it's still to this day. But it says 19 consecutive bond issues and proposals to increase the tax levy were defeated by Kansas City voters. So all of that time, no bonds passed, no increase in the tax levy, right? And in fact, you got people now saying, hey, would you guys consider reducing the tax levy? Right? This is absolutely asinine. But these are the things that we need to push out into our community so they can understand that this education issue is not really something that just befell on black children. This is George Garcia. Now, when I used to do this presentation like 16, 17, 18 years ago, not like I stopped, but I'm saying when I was doing it back then, I would put this picture up and I would say, this is George Garcia, and every time I would get a, so, like everybody thought fondly of George Garcia. He was like the superintendent, the educator superintendent. They were a teacher, then he moved into assistant principalship, and was a principal, then moved into the front office, and he had just spent his whole career in education, starting as an educator. So people have fond memories of him. But he happened to become the superintendent like right at the beginning of his said. And this is what he said after court one day. He says, administrating under a court order is a very difficult and time-consuming process. He said, we may come to a decision administratively, then we have to convince the board of directors, then we have to convince the desegregation monitoring committee, then we have to convince the court. Basically, he said there is no way to run a school district. If you got all these levels, like that's not how a healthy school district works. But that's how our school district worked for all of these years, doing decent. This is Arthur Benson in court. And he said Judge Whipple, I'm sorry, y'all, this is insensitive every time I read it. I've read it thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and I still get the same furor in my body when I read it. He said Judge Whipple's law clerk was instrumental in, this is him telling in court, testifying. He said Judge Whipple's law clerk was instrumental in recruiting Superintendent Benjamin Dempsey Jr. to Kansas City from Oklahoma. Now, my wife's a lawyer, so I get to talk about lawyers. Bad. It's time to finish. No, but a law clerk, a student that leaves law school and goes to be a federal law clerk is probably one of the best advice in law school. So I'm not like taking away from the academic rigor that a law clerk has. All I'm saying is law clerks shouldn't be picking our damn superintendents. And that's what was happening. And because I know it's happening because he's saying that it's happening in court. And if you ask me how much educational experience that Benjamin Dempsey had when he came here, I'll tell you zero, because that would be the truth. He wasn't even an educator. He was a retired bureaucrat in the Federal Aviation Administration. He handled the airports and air traffic controllers. And they brought him here, these people brought him here to be the superintendent of our school district. And they talk about dysfunction in our school district. Sorry, one more time. Maybe I'll calm down here. Back in court, this is Dr. Eugene Eubanks. Now, Eugene Eubanks is who the court tapped to be the head of the desegregation monitoring committee. Now, Eugene Eubanks, people have fond memories. He ran the education school at UMKC. People have very fond memories. He was really like a giant in education in Kansas City. But that doesn't mean that they escaped criticism. He was on the DMC. He was involved in this process, and he said after this is what he said in court. He said after Mr. Dempsey became the superintendent, he said, you know what? we defer to Mr. Dent on all significant issues, right? He said that informally relaxed our oversight of the district. Now the reason why I put that in there is because it says a lot of things. Number one, it says that we got our man in at the superintendent level. So we get kind of back up. Which is also telling you that before they had their man in, they was all in the mix. Right? Now, another thing he tells me is that, hey, we informally relaxed our oversight. But what that also saying is that we got what? Formal oversight. We still can step in when we need to. So, this is right in the time, when he comes, this is right in the time that I'm looking at all the acrimony on the news. I remember this superintendent. I remember saying stuff like, why don't we just let that man do his job? See, that's what happens when you get your information from the news. And don't get your information from the facts. Because the news can have you thinking all kinds of crazy stuff. Last one. This case went to the Supreme Court, not once, not U.S. Supreme Court. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And this is the Supreme Court, actually went the 3rd time. It said, in this case, not only did the district court exercise its legislative power to tax, it also engaged in budgeting, staffing, educational issues and decisions, judgments about the location and aesthetics of the school buildings. Basically, the Supreme Court was upset at this time. And they was like, get out of this case. You are a judicial body. You shouldn't be engaged in administrative legislative stuff. We got 3 branches of government. So this is the Supreme Court going in on the lower court. Telling them, hey, get this up, get out of that. This was in 1995. When did I tell you guys that the case finally wrapped up in settlement? 2004. So even after the Supreme Court said, hey, get out this case, it took 9 years to unravel and unwind this whole thing so they could take back over, so the school district can go back to normal. And I've put that in massive quotations. And a lot of the vestiges from this era are what we're dealing with today. So we can't think about reparations. You can't understand what we should do with reparations if you don't have a serious understanding of this case. And I'll end on this last slide because that's Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. I know y'all thought that was Uncle but it's not. This is Clarence Thomas. And Clarence Thomas says, it never ceases to amaze me that courts are so willing to assume that anything that's predominantly black must be inferior. The only sentence I think I've ever agreed with Clarence Thomas on. Unfortunately, he keeps talking. He keeps writing because he don't say nothing else. He said, instead of focusing on remedying the harm done to those black school children injured by segregation.
I never heard Dia talk about destroying the school system. My kid's grandmother is a elementary school teacher on Wyandotte side. She's always say they can't do just the language. I don't want to say it again, you know what I mean? But it's this whole language stuff. But I think as reparations, while I begin to lean into things like Bob Marley's post said, kill them before they grow. And if you don't fund it, if you don't feed something, it dies. And there was a strategy that I started to think where I get a little trigger warning is, it was people who decided what was gonna die and not die. I think about charter schools, when they took out that $2 billion, was like boom, their eyes popped open. Who helped start those charter schools? Who who had the triggers and the pulls and push and pull and the puppet master behind those things. There's some names on there, I bet. And so that's where it gets where reparations, you got to decide what you are. You got to burn your boat on some things. And me being a black man living on Paseo right now, I'm burning my boat up, and this has to be worked out. So when you start thinking about this, where's your thoughts about the charter school uprise? And like you said before, I'm from Dallas, Texas. It's crazy to have 14 teachers going around here. It's like, why does a center exist? It don't make sense. But charter schools and those things, do you think there's some things inside there that was built to defund, destabilize everything?
Everything is rooted in a cause. Yeah. In my opinion, the overarching cause of this destruction was a couple of things. One, it was deseg, right? Two, it was white liberals thinking that the only way black children could learn is if they were somehow in a classroom with white children and they could, you know, rub off those middle-class white values would rub off on those blacks somehow and they would learn, right? So those are two like major challenges with DSEG, right? It wasn't about educating black children, it was about how to recruit white children back to the district. That's always been their project. Now, after all this time, that period between 1995 and 2004, what was happening in that period was you had to, you know how you've been in a car accident and the insurance companies are fighting back about how much they're gonna settle your claim for? That's basically what was happening in Kansas City at that time. Those 9 years, the district and others, the state, the civic people, they were trying to figure out how were they going to be able to still create these special schools, if you will. How are we going to be able to take care of these white children, you know what I mean, that we were trying to use this money for to attract them back to the city center. Well, charter schools came as a result of that settlement process, right? So I never engaged in the charter versus traditional district school argument. It's like an asinine argument to me because I know the history, right? So what you have is you have the proliferation of charters primarily because of the destruction of DSEG.
Thank you. First of all, I'm 78 years old.
All right.
Amen.
And I lived through everything you're talking about, Mr. Sparkman. As a student and as a parent, I volunteered in the Kansas City School District from 1973 until 2006. And I will preempt what I'm going to say with this. There's a scripture that says, "My people perish for lack of knowledge." One of the things the school district did, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, when they excluded parents' participation and parent understanding of how things worked, then they had more control over what they did. In 1959, I went to Central Junior, which is now Central Middle. And just briefly, I'll tell you, when the teachers who stayed found out that the students were black, they never called on us anymore in class. It was predicted that when I went to Central, the people that went to Central during the time I went there, once it became predominantly black or you had a larger population of black students, that the grades were going to drop and everything, but we blew them off the roof. Because at our schools, in the segregated schools, our teachers were doctors, they were PhDs, and they had more control over what they taught us and how they taught us. When I went to Central, my class was 64. When I went to Central, we had trigonometry, physics, calculus, 4 or 5 different foreign languages. I was privileged to be taught by Dr. Jeremiah Cameron, and if anybody knows who he is, if you had him for a teacher, you really had something in your class. A few white teachers said they didn't care, they were going to stay. So we had good teachers. But what they did after, I would say, 69, they systematically dumbed down the school by taking out curriculum. So our black kids, I think it was probably after 70 that everything was kind of watered down. So that could perpetuate the lie that black students weren't as smart as white students. When I started school, we had to buy our own books at Central Bookstore there on the corner of 33rd and Indiana. I don't want to talk too long because I will say that I moved to the Marlboro area in 1973, and the first knock on my door was a white man. He didn't know I was black, and he said, I said, who is it? Because who would be coming to my house at 11 o'clock in the morning? And he said, the coloreds are coming. Do you want to sell your house? And I opened the door and I said, what color are they? Okay? During that time, the teachers were going on strike every year because of this bond issue and they couldn't get a raise. So the schools were suffering. Parents were taking their children out of schools. I know the history, but like I said, I could talk on it all day because when Mr. Sparkman was talking, my blood was boiling. Because I met those superintendents. I worked on the magnet program. I was one of the parents that wrote the proposal to form the Southwest Cluster, where the people from Shawnee Mission, the people from Overland Park, surrounding school districts came in and audited our teachers in our schools to see what kind of programs they could implement in their schools. The reason why the cluster worked, Southwest Cluster was comprised of Cook, Hartman, and Marlboro. The reason why it worked is because a group of young black parents and white parents decided, if my kids don't learn, your kids don't learn. So we put the race aside. When I moved to 73rd and Highland, where I've been for 50 years, the principal at Marlboro, they had feeder schools. She would send all the black kids to Southeast, but the white kids had a choice to go to Bingham or to Center. Then they moved the borderline for Center to 79th Street because we didn't live south of 79th Street. Then a few of us moved south of 79th Street. You know, the development out there called Linden Hills. A few of us moved out there. Most of them were lawyers and educators. And they because of Missouri law, they could go to Center School. But they still have in the Center School District people who check your residence to make sure that you live in the Center School District. Now, as far as you were asking about the living in Kansas City, if your address is, if you're in the Kansas City, Missouri area, but you're across a certain borderline, for instance, if you live east of 435, you're around Gregory, I think it's north of 85th, you go to Raytown schools. But if you live south, you go to the Hickman Mills School District. We didn't live on View High Drive. We couldn't even be caught on View High Drive. When I went to Central, if we decided we were going to go riding, we couldn't ride out here too much. So I remember Kansas City. The main thing wrong with Kansas City is pure racism. Racism and money. And even what you see the development now, that's all about money. That's all about, like you said, bringing whites back into the area. But they're still not coming. They put their kids in St. Paul's Episcopal School. They put their kids in St. Teresa's. They put their kids in the private schools. Now, I was one of the first parents, and I can say this with certainty, that was approached to meet at what's the name of the church there on the corner of Meyer and Warnham? It's an Episcopal church. It was a priest there that came to our town, and he wanted to talk to us.
Hogan Prep.
No. No, the church across from Southeast. Is it St. Andrews, St. Augustine's or something? Okay. Yeah, we met there at the church. I was part of the Southwest High School Foundation. The only black parent on there. There I was, and they were talking about starting a charter school. Charter schools were created or introduced to have an alternative to white kids to go to school without paying tuition. They were going to let a few of us, black kids, go. Well, I immediately spoke up against it. Anything that worked in this district, they tore it up. They brought new superintendents in and gave them false information to get what they wanted done. And the school board, you can't have people who don't understand how the schools work. I quit volunteering in 2006 because the parents drove me crazy. Because they were all worried about their kids. And when we realized that if my child doesn't do well, it's going to affect your child. And that's why I left. And like I said, I'm 78 years old and I got tired. I'm old school and I don't like what's going on now. I don't like what teachers have to go through. I think teachers are the next thing to God's angels to deal with what's going on in schools now. Because these children are being taught to live under an air of entitlement. They think that they need respect. You have to earn respect. Children are supposed to be considered, but we earn the respect. We are the elders. Teachers are the elders. Teachers cannot teach if they have to worry about being jumped on by parents, being cussed out by parents. Parents who can't even read. Parents who don't even know what the children are studying. When they got rid of the PTA, that was to take away the parents' lobbying power with the government. That's why they got rid of PTA. They implemented SAC so the school district could have control over what happened with the parents and the PTAs and the boosters and all of that. My son graduated from here in 2001. At the same time, I had a daughter in Lincoln Prep. I was over the boosters at both schools, and it was a mess. But I did it because I love the children. Children need to know that we're behind them. So Carnell, I thank you for asking me to come. You can tell this is a passion of mine. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.